Sir, this boy lived with me at the orphanage." Teresa's voice echoed through the mansion's hallway like a battle cry, shattering the aristocratic silence that Robert Whitman cherished so much. The real estate mogul froze in front of the vintage painting hanging on his office wall. His usual expression of irritation, the one he reserved for employees who didn't know their place, turned into something between astonishment and poorly disguised panic. Teresa Silva, 45, a cleaning lady for 6 months in that $7 million mansion, had never spoken so loudly in her boss's presence. In fact, Robert made a point of treating her like furniture, invisible, useful, disposable. "What the hell are you talking about?" Robert turned abruptly, his face red with indignation. "And who gave you permission to yell in this house?" The portrait showed a blond boy of about 8, with an angelic smile and expensive clothes. A gold plaque on the frame read, "In memory of Michael Whitman, beloved son, 1985 to 1993. Teresa pointed at the photo with her trembling hand, still holding the cleaning cloth. "Michael. That's the name he used at St. Joseph's Orphanage. But we all knew it was a lie." "You're delusional." Robert took a threatening step toward her. "My son died in a car accident at the age of 8. You have no right to talk about him." But Teresa didn't back down. Her eyes shone with an intensity that made Robert hesitate. It was the look of someone who keeps secrets too powerful to be ignored. For 6 months, she had swallowed daily humiliations. The jokes about those people, when he thought she wasn't listening. The comments about how they should be grateful to have work. The way he turned down the TV when reports of police violence came on, as if her presence bothered him. Robert Whitman, luxury real estate mogul, philanthropist for show, influential politician. To the world, a devoted widower who honored the memory of his dead son. To Teresa, a man who didn't know his world was about to be turned upside down. "Michael didn't die in that accident," Teresa said calmly, her years in the orphanage having taught her to recognize the lies of wealthy adults. "He was handed over. Like merchandise." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert blinked several times, as if trying to process impossible information. His mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. Teresa watched the reaction with silent satisfaction. For months, she had cleaned that house, watched that man, listened to his phone conversations about urban cleansing and undesirable elements. Now, finally, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. "You're lying," Robert muttered, but his voice had lost its usual arrogant authority. "Michael had a moon-shaped scar on his left wrist," Teresa continued, relentless. "He talked in his sleep about a daddy who promised to come back but never did. And he was afraid of men in suits." Robert staggered, leaning on the mahogany table. The perfect picture of his public life was beginning to crack like glass under pressure. Teresa smiled for the first time in 6 months of working in that house. It wasn't a sweet or subservient smile. It was the smile of someone who could finally lay their cards on the table. If you're enjoying this story of justice and revelations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Teresa discovered about Robert's son's accident will show how the truth can be the most devastating revenge of all. Robert Whitman felt the ground crumble beneath his feet, but his arrogance spoke louder than his shock. In his 40 years of building a real estate empire based on strategic urban development, a fancy euphemism for driving poor communities off valuable land, he had learned that attacking first was always the best defense. "Are you trying to extort me?" His voice cut through the air like a blade. "A maid making up stories about my dead son? That's pathetic, even for someone like you." The "someone like you" came out of his mouth loaded with all the venom he normally reserved for city council meetings when discussing undesirable elements in his gentrification projects. Teresa remained motionless, but her eyes flashed with an intensity that made Robert instinctively recoil. 45 years of life had taught her to recognize racists disguised as philanthropists, and Robert Whitman was a perfect example of the species. "Mr. Whitman," she said with an icy calm that completely diffused his outburst, "Michael used to draw the same house over and over again at the orphanage. A mansion with white columns, a garden with a fountain, and an office with bookshelves reaching to the ceiling. Just like this one." Robert swallowed hard. The description was too accurate to be a coincidence. During 6 months working in that house, Teresa had observed every detail, every photo, every phone conversation Robert had. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity for survival. A 50-year-old black woman, orphaned since the age of 8, She had learned early on that knowing her oppressors was a matter of life and death. Michael also drew a gray-haired man who wore gold rings, Teresa continued, her eyes fixed on the family crest ring Robert wore on his right index finger. He said this man promised to come back for him, but always found excuses. The color drained from Robert's face. That ring had belonged to his father, and it was his trademark in business. Any official photograph of Robert in the newspapers showed that ring prominently. "Stop this nonsense." Robert exploded, but his voice came out higher than normal. "My son died at the age of 8 in an accident on Interstate 75. I identified the body myself." "The body of a child burned beyond recognition," Teresa replied calmly. "Who was wearing the clothes Michael wore the day he disappeared from home? Very convenient, don't you think?" Robert froze. Those details had never been disclosed to the press. How would a simple cleaning lady know about the condition of the body or the clothes? Teresa watched the look of panic grow on Robert's face with silent satisfaction. For decades, she had carried the weight of the truth about Michael, not just his true identity, but the grim circumstances of how he had come to St. Joseph's Orphanage. Michael had nightmares every night, she continued, each word chosen to cut deeper. He would scream in his sleep about men in suits who forced him into a black car. He said his father had promised it would be just for a little while, until a difficult situation passed. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert staggered to his Italian leather armchair, his face as pale as paper. His hands trembled as he tried to process what he was hearing. Teresa had grown up in the same orphanage as Michael, but she was 8 years older. She had become his unofficial protector, the older sister he never had. Night after night, she had comforted the crying boy who asked when his rich daddy would come back for him. "You're lying," Robert muttered, but his voice had lost all authority. Why did you wait 6 months to say this?" Teresa smiled. It wasn't a sweet or sympathetic smile. It was the smile of someone who could finally reveal cards she had held for decades. "Because I needed to be absolutely sure who you really were, Mr. Whitman. And because I needed to gather the right evidence." She paused dramatically. Michael didn't die in that accident. He grew up, became a man, and had a life you never bothered to know about. Robert stood up abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at Teresa. "Get out of my house. You're fired. And if you repeat those lies to anyone, I'll sue you for defamation." Teresa didn't move an inch. Instead, she slowly removed a yellowed envelope from her apron pocket. "Funny you should mention lawsuits, Mr. Whitman. Because after 40 years of building luxury developments on top of destroyed communities, maybe it's time someone sued you." The envelope contained something that made Robert's eyes widen in absolute terror. Photos, documents, and a letter in Michael's childish handwriting, addressed to Daddy who promised to come back. Each new humiliation Robert poured on Teresa only fueled the flame of justice she had been meticulously planning for much longer than he could imagine. What that privileged man didn't know was that every act of contempt was sealing his own sentence, and that Teresa Silva wasn't just a cleaning lady who recognized a photo by chance. She was the only person alive who knew the whole truth about what really happened to Michael Whitman, and about the crimes Robert committed to hide that truth. Robert violently snatched the envelope from Teresa's hands, his eyes quickly scanning the contents. What he saw made him stagger backward as if he had been punched in the stomach. The first photo showed a young adult of about 25, unmistakably Michael, working in a mechanic's shop. The second showed the same young man dressed in a paramedic's uniform. The third showed Michael holding a nursing diploma, smiling next to an older black woman whom Robert recognized immediately, Teresa. "Impossible," Robert muttered, his hands shaking. "These photos are fake. You manipulated all of this." Teresa smiled with a calmness that made Robert's blood run cold. For 6 months, she had endured every racist comment, every condescending look, every joke about people like her needing to be grateful for a job. All to arrive at this very moment. "Michael graduated as a nurse at 23, Teresa said calmly, pulling a worn cell phone from her pocket. "He specialized in palliative care. Ironic, don't you think? The son you gave away to die ended up dedicating his life to caring for people in their final moments." Robert grabbed the table to keep from falling. "Handed him over? I never. My son died in an accident." "Michael did die, Mr. Whitman. He died at the age of 8 on the day you handed him over to those men in exchange for paying off your gambling debts." Teresa paused dramatically. What grew up in the orphanage was just a broken child trying to understand why Daddy never came back for him. The truth hit Robert like an avalanche. His legs gave way and he collapsed into the armchair, his face completely pale. 30 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled in a matter of minutes. Teresa watched the reaction with silent satisfaction. She wasn't just a cleaning lady who recognized a photo by chance. For 2 decades, she had been head nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital, the same hospital where Michael had worked for the last 5 years of his life before dying in a real accident, this time trying to save victims of a fire. Michael told me everything before he died, Teresa continued, her voice cutting like a knife. About the man in the suit who promised it would be just for a little while. About how you cried when you handed him over, saying you had no choice. About how you promised to come back when things got better. Robert tried to speak, but only a groan came out of his throat. Teresa had planned this moment meticulously. It was no coincidence that she had gotten the job at this mansion. Dr. James Fletcher, a human rights lawyer and old friend of Michael's, had helped her investigate Robert Whitman for 2 years. Fletcher had discovered that Robert had lost the family fortune in illegal gambling in 1985. Desperate and owing impossible sums to dangerous people, he had accepted a diabolical proposal to hand over his own son to a child trafficking ring in exchange for forgiveness of his debts and a loan to start over. The car accident was staged. The charred body was that of an orphan child who had died in a fire around the same time. Robert used his political contacts to speed up the identification and close the case quickly, avoiding further investigation. "Do you want money?" Robert asked desperately, his voice coming out as a croak. "I can pay any amount. 10 million, 20 million. Whatever you want." Teresa laughed, a cold sound that made Robert recoil further into his chair. "Money." She shook her head. "Mr. Whitman, you still don't understand. Michael died believing that his father had abandoned him out of shame. He died without knowing that you built an empire on the lie about his death. He died poor, alone, caring for strangers because he never managed to start a family of his own." Robert tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't obey him. What do you want then?" Teresa walked over to the bookcase and picked up a gold picture frame, a photo of Robert receiving an award from the city as Philanthropist Businessman of the Year, surrounded by orphan children whom his company had symbolically adopted. "I want you to feel exactly what Michael felt," she said, smashing the picture frame on the floor. "Abandonment. Humiliation. Despair. And most of all, I want everyone to know who Robert Whitman really is." From her apron pocket, Teresa pulled out a second phone, this one new and professional. On the screen, a bright red recording icon flashed. "This entire conversation is being broadcast live to Dr. Fletcher," she announced calmly. "And he is recording every word for the lawsuit we will file against you. Not only for abandonment of a minor and falsification of documents, but for participation in a human trafficking ring." Robert felt the world spinning around him. For 6 months, he had poured his arrogance and racism onto Teresa, without imagining that every word was being carefully documented. Every prejudiced comment, every humiliating order, every joke about people like her, all recorded, catalogued, prepared to destroy his public reputation built over decades. You planned all this," Robert muttered, finally understanding the extent of his situation. "Dr. Fletcher and I planned it for 2 years, Teresa confirmed. "Every detail. Every document. Every piece of evidence. Michael may have died without knowing the truth, but the whole world will know it." Teresa walked to the window, looking out at the mansion's perfectly manicured garden. For 6 months, she had cleaned every corner of that house built with dirty money, listening to Robert brag about his philanthropic endeavors, while treating her like disposable furniture. "Dr. Fletcher has already filed criminal charges against you," Teresa continued without turning around. "He has also sent copies of all the evidence to the federal prosecutor's office, the Internal Revenue Service, and investigative journalists from 3 different television networks." Robert's phone began to ring. Then another. And then another. Teresa smiled, recognizing the signs of a scandal about to explode. "Your lawyers must already be trying to find you," she observed, finally turning to face him. "Too bad you're busy having such an enlightening conversation with a mere cleaning lady." Robert tried to grab one of the phones with trembling hands, but Teresa was quicker. She held the receiver and with a deliberate movement, dropped it on the floor, where it shattered. Michael used to say that the truth always finds a way to come out, Teresa said, stepping on the wreckage of the phone. He was right. It took 30 years, but the time has come for you to pay for every tear he shed waiting for a father who would never return. For a moment, as she watched Robert Whitman, respected tycoon, renowned philanthropist, influential politician, completely crumble before a black woman he had treated like trash for months, Teresa felt something she hadn't experienced since Michael's death: the sweet satisfaction of seeing justice finally served. But what Robert didn't know yet was that the public humiliation and criminal prosecution were only the beginning. Teresa and Dr. Fletcher had discovered much more about Robert Whitman's business, and what was about to be revealed would make the kidnapped son scandal seem like just an appetizer for the real feast of justice that was being served. Robert's phones continued to ring incessantly as he desperately tried to call his lawyers with trembling hands. Each missed call was another nail in the coffin of his reputation, carefully built over 3 decades. "Can't you get through to them?" Teresa asked with feigned concern, watching Robert struggle with his cell phone like a drowning man trying to grab debris. "Too bad. Maybe they're busy watching the live broadcast." Robert finally managed to dial his office, but the call went to voicemail. He tried his personal assistant, voicemail. His accountant, voicemail. One by one, all the numbers he had dialed for years to solve problems now rejected him like a pariah. Dr. Fletcher was very clever, Teresa continued calmly, pulling a third recording from her pocket, this one on a gold flash drive. "You know why? Because he didn't just collect evidence on Michael. He investigated his entire career as a philanthropic entrepreneur." Robert stopped trying to call, his eyes fixed on the flash drive as if it were a bomb about to explode. 47 families illegally evicted from their homes in 2018, Teresa listed coldly. Falsified documents to speed up gentrification processes. Bribing 3 councilmen to approve projects in environmental preservation areas. Money laundering through the foundation he created in Michael's memory. Each accusation hit Robert like a well-aimed shot. For years, he had used his son's fake death as an emotional shield for his crimes, creating a front foundation that embezzled public funds intended for orphan children, a cruel irony that now turned against him like a poisonous snake. "Impossible," Robert muttered, but his voice had lost all its arrogance. "This information is confidential. No one has access to these files." Teresa smiled, not a sweet or sympathetic smile, but the smile of a predator who had finally cornered her prey. "Michael didn't just die as a nurse, Mr. Whitman. In the last 2 years of his life, he worked as a volunteer consultant for Dr. Fletcher, helping to investigate irregularities in institutions that received donations for orphan children." She paused dramatically. "Your own foundation was the main target of his investigation." Robert's world collapsed completely. The son he had sold to save his own skin had spent the last years of his life investigating the crimes his own father had committed in his name. "Michael discovered that you were stealing money intended for children like him," Teresa continued, each word cutting deeper. "Orphaned children, abandoned, forgotten by the system. The same system that swallowed him up when you handed him over like a product." Robert tried to stand up, but his legs gave way. The realization that his son had died knowing exactly who his father was, and had actively chosen to work to destroy him, was the final blow to his sanity. Robert's laptop, left open on the table, began flashing with incessant notifications. Messages from the company board, emails from angry investors, news alerts mentioning his name. Teresa walked over to the screen and turned the computer so he could see. The headline on the local news site read, "Real estate tycoon sold his own son to pay gambling debts. Exclusive recording reveals decades of crimes." Below, a video with over 50,000 views in just 20 minutes showed Robert confessing everything to Teresa, believing he was talking to just a simple cleaning lady. "Did you know your foundation had a Twitter account?" Teresa asked casually, scrolling down the page. "Over 200,000 people have watched the video where you call orphan children undesirable elements and talk about urban cleansing. Very inspiring for someone who wins awards for philanthropic work." Robert tried to close the laptop, but Teresa was quicker. She held his hand with surprising strength for someone he had completely underestimated for 6 months. "Your company's stock has fallen 60% in the last 2 hours," she continued, pointing to the red charts on the screen. 6 major investors have already withdrawn their support. The mayor has canceled the $500 million housing project contract. And oh, she smiled maliciously, the IRS has already frozen all your bank accounts." Robert stared at the screen in horror. Decades of work, an estimated $800 million fortune, a solid political reputation, all evaporating before his eyes like smoke. The house intercom rang. Teresa walked to the device with deliberate calm. "Hello? Oh yes, they can come in. Mr. Whitman is expecting them." Who's coming?" Robert asked desperately. "The FBI, the IRS, and 2 civil police deputies," Teresa replied cheerfully. "Dr. Fletcher was very efficient. He had all the warrants ready before I even started working here." Robert finally understood the full extent of his situation. For 6 months, he had poured his racism and arrogance onto a woman who was not only a witness to Michael's lost childhood, but also the undercover agent in a complex federal investigation orchestrated by the very son he had abandoned. "Why?" he muttered, finally breaking down completely. "Why did Michael do this to me?" Teresa stopped in front of the boy's portrait on the wall, the only thing in the room that remained untouched by the chaos. For a moment, her hardened expression softened as she looked at Michael's angelic face at age 8. "Because you didn't just hand him over to those men, Mr. Whitman," she said softly. "You handed over a child's hope. You taught him that love can be sold, that family is disposable, that promises are just empty words." The sound of sirens approached from the avenue outside. Teresa took one last item from her apron pocket, a yellowed letter in a child's handwriting. "Michael wrote this when he was 10 at the orphanage. He wanted me to give it to you if I ever found you." She placed the letter on the table in front of Robert. "You can read it while you wait for the police to arrive." With trembling hands, Robert opened the letter. The words written in colored pencil by Michael's small fingers struck him like daggers. "Dad, I still believe you're coming to get me. People here say you've forgotten me, but I know you're just busy. When I grow up, I want to help other kids like me find their families. And I want to show you that I've become a good man, even far from home. I love you anyway, Michael." Robert broke down in tears, finally realizing that he had lost much more than money or reputation. He had lost the chance to meet the extraordinary man his son had become, despite everything he had done to him. The sirens stopped at the mansion's door. Heavy footsteps echoed through the marble hallway that Robert had walked like a king for decades and now crossed for the last time as a defeated criminal. Teresa watched from the window as Robert was led away in handcuffs to the police car. Curious neighbors crowded the sidewalks, cell phones recording the fall of one of the most powerful men in the city. But what none of them knew was that the story was just beginning. Because Michael Whitman had left more than letters and investigations. He had left a will that would forever change the fate of every orphan child in the city, and the legacy Robert thought he had built would be completely rewritten by the hands of the son who never stopped loving the father who abandoned him. 6 months later, Teresa Silva walked through the corridors of the new Michael Whitman Missing Children Support Center, opened with the $20 million Robert was forced to pay as compensation for crimes against humanity. Robert Whitman, now serving 17 years in federal prison, had lost absolutely everything. His company had gone bankrupt, his assets had been auctioned off, his political friends had abandoned him like a radioactive outcast. Even his Twitter account had been turned into a memorial for the children he had harmed. Dr. Fletcher smiled when he found Teresa checking the final details of the inauguration. "Michael would be proud," he said, pointing to the gold plaque at the entrance that showed a photo of the young nurse smiling alongside orphan children. "He always said he would change the world," Teresa replied, watching the families reunite in the main hall. "I just didn't know he would do it even after he died." The foundation had already reunited 47 children with their families in just 6 months. The search system created with Robert's money was revolutionary, cross-referencing data from hospitals, orphanages, and police records in real time. Teresa had become the executive director of the institution, her experience as both an orphan and a nurse making her perfectly qualified to lead Michael's mission. Every child found was a victory over men like Robert Whitman. In federal prison, Robert received only one visit a month, his own sister, who came only to remind him how he had destroyed the family name. His cellmates knew exactly who he was, a man who had sold his own son, and treated him with the contempt he deserved. During the inauguration ceremony, a reporter asked Teresa if she felt sorry for Robert. "Sorry." Teresa smiled, the same expression she had used on the day she destroyed his life. "I feel sorry for the children he harmed. Robert had 30 years to do the right thing. Michael had only 25 years of life to correct his father's mistakes." Michael's last act had been to leave detailed instructions on how his death should be investigated if anything happened to him. The accident that killed him was no accident. Robert had hired thugs to silence the son who threatened to expose his crimes. But Michael knew that Teresa would fulfill his mission. In the final letter he left for her, he wrote, "If you are reading this, then justice has finally been served. Thank you for never giving up on me." Today, as she watched families hugging each other at the center named after Michael, Teresa knew that the best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, it is to build something so powerful that it makes it impossible to forget what we are fighting for. Robert Whitman's story became a case study in universities about how arrogance and prejudice destroy lives. Michael Whitman's story became an example of how true love survives any abandonment. And Teresa Silva proved that sometimes the quiet cleaning lady you despise may be exactly the person who holds the keys to your redemption or your destruction. Michael taught us that family is not blood, it's who stays when the whole world abandons you. And sometimes, justice comes disguised as a humble woman who never forgets a promise made to an orphan child. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories of people who turned injustice into purpose and abandonment into unconditional love.